We are very excited to have all of you here in the room, and certainly all of you online to talk about generative AI and sort of a host of questions that I'm sure that are top of mind for all of you. Before we do that, let's just meet our panelists in a little more detail here. So we have Jeremy Mack here, who is a solutions architect in innovation space at Synchrony Financial. He has nearly 9 years Synchrony and GE, and he also has a background in startups and a number of other agencies as well. And then we have Mike Storiali, who is the Vice President of Innovation at Synchrony. He has been in the company for nearly 5 years in incubation and has a passion for innovation and transformative technologies. Before we dive in, I'd like for each of them just take a moment to sort of talk about their teams, a little bit about their day-to-day work, so you get a sense of kind of the space they're in and the things they're thinking about, and then we'll jump into the questions. All right.
Well, thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone for coming today. We're super excited to be here with you. As Michael said, I'm Mike Storiali. I lead product incubation on the technology side for Synchrony. So I want to just talk what product incubation is for us. For Synchrony, product incubation is new products and capabilities we want to build that are on future horizons, typically things that are a couple years away. So our team is tasked with figuring out where the product market fit is going to happen for our customers. Oftentimes we're building out to trends that are pretty unknown, spaces where you think, there's probably going to be products there in the next couple of years, but we're not sure where. We work really closely with Method to do a lot of this, and we build out small, minimally viable products that we deploy to market. We test those products, and if they work, we get to pass them off to the really talented teams that scale them up. And if they don't work, we get smarter for it, our clients get smarter for it, and ultimately we kill those products off or put them on a shelf. And so we have lots of examples of ones that we put on a shelf for 3 years, only to wait for the market to mature, and then we've been able to take that off and move it forward. And so I'm very fortunate to have what I think is probably one of the most fun jobs in the company, but we couldn't do it without a really talented architect like Jeremy. So pass it off to him.
Hey everybody, what's that?
He stole your mic.
Oh, did he?
Takes one in every crowd.
Hey everybody, my name is Jeremy Mack. I'm a solutions architect with the incubation group at Synchrony. My job is to basically oversee our technical strategy and how we make our decisions. And we work with teams like Method and other folks to make decisions on we have our trends and we have trends that we're following within a specific strike zone, and the projects that we build have to follow those trends. And so for us, we're trying to create a solution or create an environment for us. We're building applications quickly. We're moving fast. We pivot quickly, make decisions quickly, which is not like the rest of the business. And it's a challenging environment, but a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun on the team. I've been with Synchrony for about 9 years or 7 years and 2 years with GE. And yeah, thank you for having us. It's a beautiful spot. This is much nicer than zooming in from my basement.
All right, great. Thank you. So, we sort of jumped into this conversation immediately and talking about generative AI. And I'm sure as the title enticed you, ChatGPT. But before we dive into the questions, let's make sure that we orient all of you and sort of online, not assuming that everyone understands when we say that, what do we mean? So, Jeremy, let's start with you. Could you provide a brief overview of generative AI and sort of, you talk about what it is, maybe provide some sort of examples out in the marketplace that really kind of highlight that?
Yeah, I think if we think about traditional AI, we're used to seeing things like chatbots, things like that. AI has been around for a very long time. And we think about just from a basic sense, it's predictive, where it's looking for patterns and things like that. With generative AI, to oversimplify it, we're creating new content, we're creating new text content, new image content, and it's everything from configurations for customers to text to help people do their emails, anything. So it's to oversimplify it, it's our ability to create using AI.
I think that's a great way to say it. I mean, I look at a lot of the AI we've done, and Synchrony and probably a lot of your companies have been on an AI journey for the better part of a decade, where we did the things that Jeremy said, right? We're looking at a database that somebody had to enter data into and saying, man, a robot could do that a lot better. And so it makes more sense for somebody to take the information from one database to the other using robotic process automation. And so that meant that AI was behind the scenes, right? No different than we didn't tell our customers that we migrated to the cloud. We didn't go and tell all of our customers that we were using RPA to make their lives better. But generative is really interesting because it puts it not only in the hands of customers, but it puts it front and center, starts to impact knowledge workers, starts to impact the way we build out products. And so without spoiling everything we're going to talk about, I think that's the most exciting part about this.
That's right. Great. So I think that, as I look at my emails, as I read articles, roughly every third one tells me that pretty soon that I won't have a job, right? That I'll be just sitting on the back burner, I guess, or on the beach maybe with too much free time. But I think that concern and fear is really ever present for a lot of folks, and I think that is informed by this feels like it's been a revolution, that has come out of nowhere. It's been that folks don't understand what it is. But the reality is that this type of fear is not new when it comes to, new innovation, new technology. So Mike, could you sort of maybe give us a little bit of history of other technologies where we've sort of run into these types of sort of emotions and reactions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the fear here is this is the first time we're seeing AI come for knowledge work, right? And it's funny because you said you might not have a job. I would argue that what's going to happen is you're not going to do the parts of your job that aren't fulfilling. And that's actually the really cool part about a lot of this, right? If we think about our jobs every day, there are so many pieces of your job that is not additive work. And AI could probably do those pieces a lot better. We've talked a little bit about, imagine when somebody sends you an email and they ask for something you've told them 3 times already, which I'm sure happens to none of you, but I can tell you it has happened to me before. And AI can draft the response for you and you can quickly review it and hit send. That's not a pipe dream. That is something that we're seeing integrations with ChatGPT into Copilot into Microsoft Outlook. And so that creates space where the non-additive part of your job gets better. I think the other side, though, to your point, Michael, is where has this happened before? We talk about the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen without the Agricultural Revolution. If we have to be farming for our basic needs, you can't have the next thing that happens. If you look at today, we don't have podcasters or software engineers, probably, if we all still have to be farming, right? There are other things we would have had to be doing. And so this is disruptive. What it's doing is it's opening the door to net new things. We talked briefly in prepping for this. I said at a program of my size in the 1970s, I would have had a bookkeeper. How many of you guys have a bookkeeper versus just using Excel, right? You probably are managing your own books, but that doesn't mean that people who had a passion for mathematics went away. They went into data modeling. They went into credit modeling. They went into forecasting. And now we do things that are so much more robust and so much more mature than simply keeping tabs on books.
I think if you, I'm a 90s kid. So if you think back to the 90s, I always bring up this, sorry, Mike, I'm going to bring it up again. I bring up this YouTube video that I saw with, it was Bill Gates on the David Letterman show. And he was talking about this new thing called the internet and email and how it was going to disrupt newspapers, magazines, television. David Letterman and the entire crowd laughed at him, and he laughed right along with him because he knew it was coming. And I think that back then journalists were scared for their jobs. There were a lot of people who were scared for their jobs, and everybody pivoted. Here we are today. I think with the technology, we need to embrace it like we did back then. Embrace it, be curious about it, explore. I think that this is a rare opportunity where the technology is ahead of us and it's waiting for us to discover it. And in the past, we haven't been in a position like this before, and it's a fascinating place to be. We just need to get out there and explore.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that there's a phrase I often use really is that having, aggressive curiosity in terms of how we can figure out how to think about something. How do we then talk about it to others within our companies and to our customers? How do we implement it, right? And then how do we evangelize how we implement it? And so I think folks are looking for rubrics and sort of frameworks of how to take all this information out there and putting into a way for them to then sort of carry forward. with that in mind, I think there are a lot of folks here, just looking at sort of the invite list, saw a lot of folks from the product world. And so I think a lot of folks are wanting to understand sort of really at least sort of two views. One is, how do I think about using this technology in my existing products, both in the products I use to do my job or products that I'm building. And then the other piece of that is, how does this influence or affect how I think about designing new products, right? And those are really two different things. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think let's first kind of unpack how this impacts products that are out there today. So if I think of the evolution that we've had of search marketing or discovery on the internet, we went from keywords to phrases. Now we're going to full-on prompts. And so you could imagine a world not too far off into the future where instead of planning your vacation, you're describing your vacation. You're explaining to a prompt how you want that vacation to feel, how much travel time you're willing to have every day, what the dietary restrictions are of your kids, what the types of activities are that you prefer, and that comes back to you with a fully fleshed out itinerary and suggestions. That is a really new way of looking at the individual products that we've had, right? There are sites out there that their whole job right now is to aggregate reviews and aggregate ideas, right? We look at TripAdvisor and Yelp and Expedia, and you start to say, wow, that kind of takes all of the stuff they've figured out and changes that. I think that discovery shift affects all of our products. If customers are going out there and searching for things in a net new way, either by describing those things or by being told things that seem true, right? Because I think this is one of the interesting things is that generative AI often responds in a very truthful manner, whether or not it's accurate, could really change the way that customers ultimately search for products. I want to pass it to Jeremy to kind of add on to that before we go into how to build those products.
I mean, I take the engineering approach. I look at it and how it could augment engineering and how we build things. We've all heard about Copilot. Some of us may not have heard about Copilot. It's a way for us to program quicker. It's a way for us, like typically for engineers, we have this site called Stack Overflow. I see a t-shirt over here. We have a site we use called Stack Overflow. We're Googling and we're pulling pieces of code together and we're building our applications based on other people's knowledge. I think with generative AI and the tools that are available today, we can actually start to think about pair programming with a robot and make and produce quicker. And we've even been talking about the new release with Adobe. Think about what this does for UI designers. Now with Adobe's doing stuff where they're expanding photographs and things like this. I think of it as a way that we can augment to build products a lot faster for sure.
Yeah, I think, we were trying to talk about how does this change the product development lifecycle? And so before you even get into what could I do to put these into my products, you probably look internally and say, how does it impact the way that my team can build? So Jeremy mentioned designers, and we talked earlier about non-additive work and asking your designer to build out a new page in your mobile app for a single new piece of functionality is probably not the story that they look for in this sprint. That's not the exciting story, right? They want to do creative, deep thinking, new work. And so maybe a generative AI that understands your component libraries and your brand guidelines and your design guidelines, that gets to 80% of the way there, right? So you describe it and it gets to 80% of the way there, and then the designer does some tweaks. And then when that goes back to the engineering team or the product owner, to be able to now say, you know what, actually, we need this to be 10 pixels smaller, but it needs to remain ADA compliant and in our brand guidelines. That's not a prompt I can give today. I would need to go back to my designer to reprioritize those changes. And today, that changes how fast my life cycle goes.
I think that folks are, looking to continue to sort of take this knowledge of, all right, that sounds great, but give me a practical use case today, right? So what can I do today? What are the areas of my business today that I can then go and create a business case against, right? To then use this technology, right? So I know we talked about some are like content generation, right? For example, I think there is the ability to go out and really with very little effort, generate vast amounts of content. Again, whether or not that content is accurate or not is certainly up for debate. But the speed at which that could be generated is really quite unique. we talked about engineering as well. Do you have any other areas in terms of the software development lifecycle that you think could be impacted besides just from the coder?
Yeah, one of the pieces that we've been talking about is think about when we think about in finance, just like a lot of different corporate entities, you have different silos of the space. You have governance, you have risk, you have legal, you have all these different groups that you need to talk to. Usually it turns into many weeks of meetings. Now imagine if we had something that knew that pillar so well and had all the documentation, all of the regulatory requirements, everything in one piece, and you can just ask it a question. You can get a sign off and you can get that information quick. That's the type of stuff that I think that there's a ton of value in us trying to think about how we can get that information into a large language model to start thinking about how we can piece these things together and work quickly, work faster, eliminate process.
It's funny because Michael, you asked about like what could you do inside your organization. We did a hackathon a couple of weeks ago around this. I'm sure lots of you guys do hackathons in your organizations, and we kept our prompt relatively broad. We didn't want people to focus internally or externally. One of the areas that really fascinated me was how many people thought of this for sales, and the idea that if you're going after your inside sales team is going after a partner or a relationship or whatever this is, don't use this on us. I could just see getting a generative AI thing from Evan next time. But being able to go and scrape, what is the stuff that they've been out there talking about? What are the systems that they use? What are the things that are important to them? And generate my first welcome email based on what I know about that potential client. Imagine how disruptive that is to your inside sales team in a good way, right? They're not going to shun generative AI when that changes their job. They're going to be like, absolutely. Here is the company that I'm looking to target. Here's what I want to give for information. Here's my pricing. Tell me what my pricing model is based on their size. That research takes your teams a long time today. And so just that right there is one that you say, wow, I could implement that tomorrow if I needed
to. I think, sort of based on this response, it really makes me think about the question is, well, where does that information exist, right? So are you using things like ChatGPT or Bard or tools that exist within the public domain, right? Are you able to then bring these models within your walls of security, whether that's your own data center or whether that's your own private cloud, to actually then and certainly secure that information for your teams to use?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how do you start to create LLMs, right? The models that power all of this that are permissioned and appropriate, right? So even internally, Jeremy and I are on the same team, but I'm in tech strategy and Jeremy's in engineering. Our LLM should probably be at least slightly different, right? The question you're asking is going to probably be looking for a much more technical answer than mine. But then that goes way deeper when you start talking about, to your point, bringing in Bard or ChatGPT or Copilot and now saying what happens if I feed it information. I think we've been here before. This was a problem as everybody migrated files onto servers 20, 30 years ago, right? Where everything had to be permissioned. It's probably why we're seeing Microsoft say one of the first LLMs that they're going to give you is going to use your email inbox. Because what is that but a permissioned LLM for you, right? That is giving you all of the knowledge that you arguably are supposed to have, unless somebody sent you the email in error. But all of the information that you're supposed to have is there. And so that's a really good first start, but that gets really complicated as we start to look at that on an enterprise level. And so I think you're going to see over the next 12 months, we're already seeing ChatGPT and Bard and others start to say, how do I make this licensable so that it can be under NDA for an organization to use locally? But there's going to be a lot of complex questions to answer there.
Speaking of complex questions, ethics, right? You can't read an article today where the question about ethical implications of technology is coming up. And so what should folks be keeping in mind as they sort of navigate introducing this technology into their environment? If we even know what that answer is.
I don't pretend that we have all those answers, but I think you have to go into it eyes wide open and recognize that AI hallucinates. That's the best way we can say it. If you continue to ask it questions about the same thing, it's going to give you increasingly strange answers. We just need to understand its limitations at all times. I think these, again, though, are some of those questions that we asked at the dawn of the internet. I remember being in middle school and having to be taught that Wikipedia is not a citable reference in a research paper. None of you have to be taught that now, right? But we do now have to look at something like generative AI and say, okay, how do I make sure that if I'm starting to identify bias in my results, that I can train those out of the model? How do I put guardrails and limitations? We're seeing the big tech players already start to do that as they see them go off the rails or start to hallucinate, saying, okay, the good news is we can tell it to ignore some of that stuff or to block that piece out, or that this is as far as that answer can go. But there are some real risks to it that just means that we need to be eyes wide open about what those risks can introduce into our organizations.
It's almost like you need AI policing AI.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah, here's an easy question. Should AI be regulated?
I'll let you go. Go ahead.
So I come from a regulated industry. I think there's an interesting question about what would be regulated. So I don't know that I have the answer for should it, because I'm not going to pretend that I have the inner workings of ChatGPT or Bard. But what would we regulate is the question that I have. There are high school kids who could run an LLM on their computer. So what does regulation do? I think we need to think really hard about that and try to say, okay, if ethics are a problem, and I don't think it's an if, ethics are a problem, and making sure that this is something that can have guardrails around that, how do we think intelligently about that? I think the really encouraging thing is we all kind of want to talk about that right now. I don't think people are shying away from the idea of where the regulation would come in for artificial intelligence, how we would understand the black box, especially when it starts to do things that perhaps have bias in it. That could be a real concern. We talked about products. What if the products it's creating now have really serious biases in them? That introduces a whole new level of risk into your organization. And so there's a balancing act there, but I do think people are asking the right questions, which is exciting for me.
So when we think about security, I'm sure many of you have heard about Samsung and the fact that some of their proprietary software code was released. They actually used ChatGPT, while looking up, trying to resolve a problem. And ChatGPT has gracefully ingested that information and exposed them. And so you've seen a rash of companies really come out immediately, restricting the ability for their employees to be able to use ChatGPT within the workplace. Jeremy, what are some of the broader security implications that or frameworks we should be thinking about as we're even playing with the technology?
And Mike was talking about the hackathon we had, which was they opened up ChatGPT for a short amount of time for us to use it, and then they had to bring it back down. And the reason for that was because, obviously, from what Michael was saying here, if we start feeding it code to test as engineers, we can have this thing writing code for us. But if we start feeding it example code, the next person who Googles, does the search, our code's going to start turning up exactly what happened with Samsung. And I think that what we ended up doing as a result of the hackathon was, listen, here's what it looks like if we had something like ChatGPT, but here's what we should do. Here's the responsible thing. We need to bring this inside of our walls. We need to keep it within our system, within our space, and maintain control of it. Because once you start letting the broader audience in, it starts getting risky.
Yeah, and I think it goes kind of a layer deeper than security. Data loss prevention is obviously real when it comes to something like this, a la Samsung. But then I think it starts to go deeper, which is, in your organization, there are times that things that were true on Monday are not true on Friday. And so that gets really interesting as well. What happens when you convert a system and you now have to tell it, forget everything you know about the old system? It doesn't exist anymore, right? We're not thinking about that when it comes to ChatGPT or Bard, because those are public models. And the assumption is that what it's being used to train the AI will train it with that new information, and it's getting real time. But it goes far deeper than security and goes into accuracy when you start to think about how that would work within your own company.
I think one of the sort of key things here that we're getting at is education for a workforce. is really going to be, really critical. And I think we need to understand if our current even training systems are even appropriate, right? And we might can use AI as part of that, right? So it feels like that every day that I wake up, like Adobe was a great example yesterday, right? Adobe announced a new beta product. There is an acceleration to how fast folks are coming out with new products, new headlines, new capabilities, and folks are like, I can't keep up, right? And we haven't answered these questions on the ethics. We are waiting for our, government or other regulators to catch up. Should we put a pause? Should we put some guardrails to slow companies down so that we can get these frameworks in place, right? That's kind of an onion.
Yeah, I don't pretend to know how Congress thinks, and I'm not going to try. But I will say that I think exploration is important. I think, it's not about not being prudent in how you explore, but ultimately we need to make sure that we're exploring this stuff. And so I think, look, the people who are making the decisions probably understand a lot better than me what the broad impacts are and why Congress is so interested right now. And they certainly talk about that. I think really where we're focused on is how do you try to make sure that you understand the risks inside your own organization, where we can leverage it, where we should leverage it, and probably just as importantly, where we shouldn't.
Oh, go ahead. I can't follow Mike like that. He's got it.
We do have a pretty large audience, and so one of the things we wanted to do is we felt like there'd be significant value in opening up questions both to the audience, both here and online as well. So we love for this to be a dialogue. So we'll take one of the microphones, maybe folks walk around. So if you have any questions here, we'd love to have this be a dialogue.
Thanks, guys. Great talk. With the proliferation of open source LLMs out there, that's coming out left and right, Dalai Lama, Vicuña, all sorts of open source projects, getting faster and smaller. Do you see the future of LLMs being more in the closed systems like OpenAI and Cohere and so on, or more in the open source realm?
I'll pass it to the engineer in a second.
Just because there's a lot of implications there about how it's regulated and how you can regulate open source versus those closed systems.
I mean, I think it is a really good question, right? Because what I said before is you could run an LLM on your machine locally, and so the regulation question is one that I'm really curious to see how people answer that. I think the open source versus closed is actually going to be a lot more about what the use case is. What do I want to get in, and what don't I want to get in? Jeremy mentioned Stack Overflow before, right? There are times that engineers in this room will use Stack Overflow to build a piece of code, and there are times that you can't because what you're doing is unique to the organization you're working within. And so I think LLMs are going to follow a really similar model to that. What's going to be interesting is how they end up talking to each other. If they can talk to each other, do they learn from one another? If so, is that a feedback loop or is that a positive thing? We're not really sure. So I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions there, but it's a really good point.
I think it's interesting because I have my own personal opinions, but when I think about something like ChatGPT, the amount of data that it took to not only begin that, but the amount of data that's been continually being pumped into that system that's closed is gigantic, and the infrastructure is massive to do that. So, I mean, when we're talking about our own LLMs that we're spinning up, it's through open source, it's a completely different ballgame. I think it's all dependent on the data and what you're feeding. And I think it actually opens up a larger question on risk, which we've talked about before, which was fraud. How do you stop the guys who are coming in with AI, and how do you identify? Like they're going to be able to, they've access now to technology that they can exploit things that that maybe we haven't even thought of yet. So it's definitely an interesting space. We'll see where it goes. Either way, I have my own personal opinions, like I said, around whether it should be regulated or not. But I mean, where we're at today is awareness. We have to be aware of what's happening out there and just tinker. learn.
Yeah. I think you'll see a movement. Think about Red Hat and Linux, right? They came in and provided value-added services on top of open source items, right? So when you think about creating language models for, say, the medical industry or other very specific industries, I think there'll be an ecosystem that'll be created that'll be able to take those smaller models, right? Because they don't have the same cost implications for standing and feeding up, and the information that can be provided to them are really specific and tied to use cases. And so I think that's going to be another realm where you see folks really say, I can use this, we can control this. And you may even get to where you can say, this is sponsored by the AMA, the American Medical Association, right? They've come along and created guidelines for this particular set of things. So I think when we look at the use of smaller models, that actually then I think makes it a little bit easier for some of the guardrails to be put in place.
This is so fascinating. Even walking in, talking to people about what they're doing, it's just really mind-blowing. And the vacation thing works. We're going into summer. I presented my husband with a proposal, and he said, I don't believe you did that on ChatGPT. And he said, I said, why'd you do that? I go, look at these numbers. He goes, okay. So my tip on that is,
Love that.
It was fun. I said, he's a runner. So I said, runner, hiker, art lover, craft beer enthusiast, and coffee lover. It gave me price ranges, things to do. I did Europe and the United States in a car trip. So that was fun. And I do have a question for you, though. You mentioned training, and I'm a trainer, and I would love to know what kind of training you think people need, because I feel like you're right on about that. And I think companies aren't quite sure what to ask for.
So it's interesting. We had this conversation. We have a really innovative and forward-thinking HR team, and we actually had this conversation with them in our company. I think at the very basic level, we need to train people in the way that we did when the internet came out on how to prompt, right? You guys might remember that we're training people on how to search on the internet, how to string keywords and phrases together, how to describe what they want, and then ultimately how to interpret that information. Now, I think one thing that we initially said, and we're already seeing companies start to affect some change here, is we said, you have to know that what it spits back to you might still need to be fact-checked, right? What we are starting to see is, Adobe, for example, spits out 6 photos that you can choose from, right? When you use it to remove something out of a photo, or we're seeing that Bard gives you 3 answers. It tells you, here's the one that I picked, but there are 2 other ones you could have. I think the next piece of that is how to use it effectively and when. I think there are probably a lot of people who are looking at this and saying, can I take ChatGPT's response and copy and paste it into an email? There might be times the answer is yes, but I would suggest that people are going to have to understand, how do I take that draft and clean it up, right? So I'm going to take something and I'm going to use it in a way that becomes a tool for me to do my job, but again, doesn't replace my job. Curious from an engineering standpoint.
I'm going to speak. I'll speak for specifically around engineers, actually, because this is something interesting for me, because there's this new concept called prompt engineering that engineers are aware of if you're in the space. And what's interesting about that is that we all, as engineers, we've been doing this for decades. My buddy and I at work, we joke that we're all highly paid Google searchers, because as engineers, we do a lot of Googling. And we talk to Google in a way, we have been talking to Google in a way that not the average human does. Like, the average civilians out there living their life, and they will say in Google, they'll type in, I want to get a coffee cup, or I'm looking for a coffee cup. An engineer will say, I'm looking for a coffee cup at 3 p.m. On Tuesday, and it needs to be delivered to me on 2nd Street. And it'll give you the exact down to the detail. Engineers have been doing this for years. And I think that there's a ton of value in realizing that and looking to your engineering teams, because they may already actually be prompt engineers and not even know it.
We've got an online question here. How do we ensure that people stay at the center of decision-making processes and have the ability to understand, evaluate, validate AI-generated outcomes as AI systems get more sophisticated?
I think the good news is artificial intelligence is not new to corporate America. And so the idea of how do we make sure that we understand the black box? How do we make sure that people know what to do when they get outputs? Those questions have had to be answered for many of us over the last decade. And so we have processes and systems in place, I think, for probably all of us that already think really hard about how are we going to be able to use these things in a way that is safe and sound and has appropriate procedures and limitations around it, which I know is not the fun, sexy part to talk about, right? Is that we're going to need to put limitations around it. But we've put limitations around almost every other tool that we use because we need to make sure that people are using them in an appropriate manner. So I actually don't think that's a new problem to try to solve. I think that's a problem that we've been solving for years, and we're just on a journey that now we have to solve it with something new.
Hello, hello. So my question is, and I will sort of keep it within photography or an article. I know that in April, I have the opportunity to hear the talk by Professor Valor, who is actually a philosopher in AI. She came down from Scotland, so that was a really insightful talk, and it focused on ethics. So recently, I've been getting articles I subscribe to that are being labeled AI content is AI generated. To me, I wasn't sure whether the value of the article connected with me because it was that human element, not knowing what part of it was by the author versus generated. That was one thing. So my question is, what are your thoughts about having things tagged so that you know it's AI generated? And same thing with Photoshop's photography. How do you validate a copyright if you don't know which one's real?
Yeah, I think those are awesome questions. And it harkens back. I don't know how many of you guys listen to or read The Verge. It's one of my favorite tech publications. And they've been having this debate over what is a photo. I think Photoshop, as weird as that conversation is, Photoshop's new generative AI tool really does ask that question. What is a photo anymore? If I took the picture and then told the AI to make the picture exactly what I wanted it to be, did I take that picture? Is a really interesting question. I do wonder a lot about how it impacts creatives, both for the in a positive way and in a negative way, right? There is an opportunity where maybe creatives can take their work and change the aesthetics of it. So let's imagine that there's some really great fan art that I create for Ted Lasso, and I want to change the aesthetic. It's top of mind for me right now. Don't spoil anything. I didn't watch it last night. But maybe I want to change the aesthetic to match different styles. And so it was my art, but I now want to put it in different mediums. That's really cool for me. That might allow me to expand my art to new people and new platforms. And I don't think that takes away from the artist. But then there's a flip question, which is, well, what if the AI was trained on my art? And now what happens to my uniqueness and my brushstrokes and my style? And how does that start to change? And is that art in the sense that maybe a really, really good prompt engineer spent days writing a prompt that generated that art, and so maybe it's a new medium, or maybe it's stolen. I think we're going to have real interesting questions about that because, without being a lawyer, copyright law asks a whole lot about, is it something that replaces the original work? Is it something that challenges the original work? I don't know that we have those answers yet when it comes to artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and I think another question that I heard in there really is, what is the human reaction to content when it's generated from AI? Do we have the same sort of relationship with that information? Do we have the same trust of that? And how does that relationship change? And does that change our relationship with the medium that we're reading, right? And so I know that Andy, one of our strategists here, has been looking at the communications, right? And so there are studies happening that are looking at when someone knows that content comes from AI, right? What, how do they believe that, how they react with it? When they don't know for sure, but they know that it could be, there's a whole nother set of reactions to it, right? So, we've been talking about sort of the product and sort of making assumptions that all those things are good, but there is an element of human emotion and sort of internal sort of angst that's coming along here that's being explored as well. So I think there are a lot of questions to be answered there.
We got one all the way up here. we can make you run.
So you talked earlier about sort of this new technology removing the additive work out of all of our roles, right? So it's going to allow us to focus on, higher priority items and better use of our skills. What are the roles that you foresee that are new? So like not jobs that exist now, but jobs that will exist as a result of this technology. And I think about things like before social media, there were no social media managers, or before Google and search, there were no SEO specialists. Like I'm really excited for the implications it has for all of our roles, but I'm also wondering, well, what's out there? Will there be a sort of LLM managers for the enterprise at every company? Almost like there are IT like infrastructure managers that manage your server farms, things like that. So what do you guys foresee as far as like, new jobs?
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting ones is prompt engineer, which Jeremy already mentioned. And I think that is not something to laugh at. I think prompt engineering is going to be real for everyone. And this includes my wife, who was an English major, who was told that degree was not going to get them anywhere. It sure as heck is now. Because suddenly being an English major who knows how to do prompt engineering is probably going to be really important. I do think there are going to be some interesting additional opportunities there, though, right? So you start to look at where this is going to permeate in an organization. It's unlikely that it's going to be centralized, right? When we look at a lot of different new technologies that came out, we created teams that use that piece of technology, but we never created a team that managed the internet at our company, right? There are certainly network teams who provide the pipes for the internet, but we don't have a team that if you need to start something on the internet, you go to. And so I think what's going to be really interesting is each team is going to end up having to define what is it that I need and what does that role look like? And so a UX team might have somebody who becomes an expert on this, or perhaps it's expected that every UX designer now understands how to do something like this. The other piece that I like to look at is kind of the time frame of how these technologies develop. And I often like to say that if we look at TikTok today, that started back with the Palm Pilot, which was a limited use case. You had to go Palm Pilot to BlackBerry to iPhone, and then a whole ton of incremental innovation to be able to get to TikTok, right? It was hard to even upload a photo on your iPhone on Wi-Fi 10 or 12 years ago, and now we're live streaming from concerts. And so I think the incremental innovation that's going to happen in between there, we can't yet see. And that's the thing that's going to open it up beyond what we currently see as use cases.
Yeah, I think there's also going to need to be a lot of innovation actually at the hardware level. The amount of data is just growing exponentially, right? So when we think about storage technologies, database technologies, and how efficiently we need to effectively store data in order to be able to store that data at scale, in a cost-effective manner. And so we're going to need to see improvements in networking, data, et cetera. So I think you'll see a push for additional innovation at those levels as well. And so while those aren't necessarily net new, they will continue to not take those jobs away, but in fact reinforce that we need innovation in many of these core technologies.
This is what I think Michael and I were talking about this earlier, and I think that there's a whole layer of data management that needs to be in place for us to be able to take advantage of this. And there's a level of efficiency that you need to be able to pull that information and return it fast. So data specifically, I don't think anybody's ready right now and that has the infrastructure to support this type of stuff yet. So I think that's first and foremost is to get the data situation figured out. But I think too, I wanted to point out was prompt engineering. I think that I think today it's a hot term, but I feel like it's going to be something that just becomes something of a piece of our social fabric. I think it's just going to start to become something that everybody does. If you think about something in my world as basic is HTML. My grade school kids learning HTML. I was being flown across the country in '96 to interview because I knew HTML. You know what I mean? So like now I feel like we're in a position where prompt engineer is a new hotness, but I feel like down the road, it's just everybody's going to know how to communicate with these things effectively.
Kids that are growing up learning how to prompt engineer.
Exactly. Yep.
We got another question from online. You listed a few things that you wanted AI tools to do right now. What's stopping from those being implemented right now? Is it privacy, speed, understanding, tech availability, or capabilities?
So I think the blockers that are there are not long-term blockers. I think at a very high level, we have the companies who make the technology, recognizing the complexity of it and the impact that it can have, and they're slow walking it a little, probably more than they had even expected to. And so I think part of that is just being careful, right? We can kind of just lay out like fraud and risk people are going to be happy because people are being careful. I think the other pieces, though, are starting to try to figure out where your use cases are. So like, let's talk internally. Well, where is my LLM? That is a really complex question to unpack, especially inside of an organization, right? It is why probably we're starting to see Microsoft say, well, we'll start with your email inbox because that's something that we know is permission to you. And so those really complex questions, I think, are they're not permanent blockers, but they are areas where we're looking to experts to be able to say, how can I overcome this in a way that I feel comfortable using it and don't regret it later?
Yeah, and I think we've talked about GitHub Copilot before, and I think Microsoft has their own version of it, and there's even Microsoft is going all over the place with this, but for obvious reasons. But GitHub Copilot, for instance, is interesting because we want it, engineers want it, we want to use it, but we don't necessarily want our information, what we're editing, to be out there. We don't want, I think the same thing's going to apply to Firebird for Adobe. If we start getting to a stage where UI engineers or UI developers or designers are getting to a point where they're using Photoshop to design their UIs, where's that information going when you're saying generate my UI that has 3 text boxes and all of that? Like, where does all that go? I think that's right now for us is a big blocker. Like, how do we bring that all in house with these third-party companies?
All right, we've got another online question. It's always hard to guess the future, but when do you think the AI curve will flatten out? Right now, it's still climbing, but do you feel what we see today is as far as AI will go for the next few years, or is this just the beginning?
I think it's just the beginning, but we should recognize that there's a hype curve for a reason, and we're going to hit a trough of disillusionment at some point, right? There's going to be a moment that people say, wait a minute, that did something that I wasn't expecting and I don't trust it anymore. Or my company tried to implement it and it caused a huge problem and we didn't like it. Or you see that it has limitations. I think the really interesting part about it is that generative AI is not a product unto itself. It's a catalyst and an enabler. And so that makes things a little more unique in the way that the internet was a catalyst and an enabler, right? New products that we couldn't before imagine were created on that. There's no part of me that believes that the original inventors of the iPhone imagined a world where TikTok existed. And so it was a catalyst to be able to get there. And so I think you're going to hit a trough at some point. It would be extraordinarily unique for us to not see that in a trend. But I also think that because it's a catalyst and an enabler to us building other things, it's probably going to have some pretty unique staying power.
Yeah, I mean, I think your example of the internet is spot on in that we don't go around today talking about the internet, right? It is just part of the existence that we have. And I think AI, to the extent it is going to be the same way. We're not going to go around continually, I don't think, talking about generative AI, right? We're going to talk about the tools and systems and products and services that sit on top of those capabilities and how we interact with those and how those impact and affect our lives. So I think it really is going to be, how does it become woven into the fabric of what we do and who we are?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be, we have to be patient. And I keep going back to this concept of tinkering, and we have to play with it and learn it. It's ahead of us. We have to catch up as close as we can and try to understand how we take advantage of this. Because if we think about using the internet again, we had to go through so much. If you go back over the years and look at how many billions of dollars were lost due to security flaws. That's why TLS exists. That's why OAuth 2 and all these technologies to secure all these applications exist, because we lost billions and billions of dollars in fraud. We're probably going to see some painful things like that over the next few years, decades, however long it ends up being, before we get comfortable with it. But again, I think it's so important that we explore and try to learn as best we can with the tools that are out there, and just try to teach ourselves this technology and try to get comfortable with it and learn it.
As someone who works in engagement, like you said, everybody is talking about AI right now and it's everywhere. So on a personal level, what do you find interesting? Like what cuts through the noise, what topics are engaging, and what kind of makes your eyes roll?
So I geek out a lot over the how is it going to change the world stuff that we were talking about with like copyright. What is a picture? What medium is this? You're already seeing artists embrace it and artists shun it. So I think that one's really interesting for me. The other is I love automating parts of my life that I don't find additive. And so I have found that it has been really helpful for me in doing things that are more complex. And I think that's a space that is really exciting. I am a Yankees fan, but want to go to a Boston Red Sox game with a friend. And I asked Bard to give me the tickets, the games that had the most tickets available on Sundays in June and July, ranked in order of the lowest ticket price. And so then I gave him the top 3 and said, which one you want to go to? That would have taken me an hour and a half to go back and forth, clicking through different tabs in the past. And so that's something that that's not an everyday occurrence for me. But I actually think that's the cool part, right? I didn't suddenly become addicted to using this thing. It is a tool that now allows me to live my life better.
Yeah, I'm on a personal level, I'm so basic with it. I look at ChatGPT. I have 4 kids, and I was telling our team this, that the most exciting moment for me was when I said, I have 4 kids. These are our allergies. I need recipes for the next 5 days. And it started listing everything out. And I had, well, one of them was really bad, but most of them were pretty good. But on a larger scale, I get fascinated thinking about things like gambling. What's going to happen to gambling when people start feeding all the sports data into these things? What's going to happen to the economy? Like, what happens when we start thinking about flattening, like when we talk about stock trading and things like that, like if we have technology that can start anticipating to a crazy level, how does that start to flatten things out? What happens? You know, it's an interesting thing to think about. That type of stuff to me is, I wonder where that's going to go.
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of people saying they're using it as their financial advisor. And I am very interested to watch them do that. I have no desire to myself, but I am here for the ride.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, you know, today I have a 7-year-old son, and I kind of joke that his 2 sisters are Siri and Alexa, because he hears us call their name quite often. But I was having a conversation earlier about weather and sort of the, you know, prediction of weather and how it's going to impact different types of industries. And so as we are able to quickly sort of query sort of data and information, how does weather patterns, weather changes impact the movement of people, right? So as we think about sort of the coastlines and that sort of thing, so from that sort of global scale, predicting migration patterns that you need to move your population, right? And how does that have implications to, you know, affect cities and planning and that sort of thing. So I'm really kind of curious as to how these systems can only help us begin to think about her.
Thanks, everybody. I feel like that's a great question to end on. Let's give it up for our panel and panelists, Mike, Jeremy, and Michael.